Paris, back in the year 1750, a gentleman by the surname Legal was playing a friendly game. He opened with one e4, Black responds with e5, leading to the Italian opening. Black replied with d6, White developed the knight to c3, and then came a rather insecure move, bishop g4, pinning the knight. But suddenly, Monsieur Legal lifted his pinned knight and captured on e5. Black thought Legal had lost his mind and, without a second thought, captured the queen. But then the bishop came into f7 with check. The king had only one square, e7, and that is when knight d5 arrived, checkmate. It is worth noting, this all happened in just 7 moves. Since then, this checkmate has been known as Legal's mate, and it is one of the hundreds of opening traps that exist in chess. This exact checkmate we just saw is unlikely to repeat itself move by move, but what will show up again and again is the core idea behind it, an undefended bishop on g4 and the vulnerable f7 square under threat. And it is this pattern that creates so many traps across different openings. Let's take an example where Black opts for the Petrov defense. In the main line, the e5 pawn is captured right away. But instead of going for the main line, Black can also choose to play the Stafford gambit with the move knight c6. White captures the knight, Black recaptures, and now the pawn on e4 is under attack. It must be defended, for example, with d3. The development continues with bishop c5. At this point, there are many reasonable ways to continue. But where's the mistake? Well, it comes when White plays the bishop straight to g5. The f2 square is under attack, and the bishop undefended. The position looks different, opposite colors, different setup, but the underlying idea is exactly the same. And once again, it leads to the move knight takes e4. The queen is captured, then comes bishop takes f2, check. The king moves to e2, and here there's a small difference. This time, there's no knight ready to jump to d4 with mate. But it does not matter, the bishop takes its place. Bishop g4, checkmate. And just like that, we can find dozens of traps across different openings with both colors, where the same tactical pattern repeats itself over and over. Sometimes the exact sequence changes, or the moves come in a different order, but the idea stays the same. Let's go back for a moment. Suppose we are now playing a queen's gambit and the pawn is accepted. The game can continue, for example, with e4. Black responds with e5. It is not ideal to capture right away, since the queens would be traded and White would lose the right to castle. So it is better to play knight f3. Then comes d takes e4, and White recovers the pawn with bishop c4. The game is still within the main line, and there are several correct ways to continue. One of them is knight c6. But in many cases, the mistake comes when bishop g4 is played, a bad move. Once again, we see the f7 square under threat, and the bishop on g4 undefended. First, we play bishop takes f7. Once the king captures, we go for knight e5 with a double attack. White recovers the pawn, gets the piece back, and leaves the opponent without the right to castle, ending up with a clear advantage. Let's look at another example, this time from the Scandinavian defense, although it could easily happen in many other openings as well. After e4 and d5, the pawn is captured. The queen recaptures, then comes knight c3 attacking it, and it retreats to d8. The game can continue with bishop c4, knight f6, and knight f3. In this position, many players play bishop g4, trying to prevent their own bishop from getting trapped, but it turns out to be a serious mistake. In this case, the bishop is actually defended, but even so, the same tactical theme works, and White has the luxury of choosing between two winning continuations. They can go for knight e5 right away, just like we saw earlier, sacrificing the queen, because if it is captured, bishop takes f7 follows, and that's checkmate. Alternatively, depending on the position, the first player can start with bishop takes f7 first. Once the king captures, White plays knight to e5, delivering a double attack and securing a clear advantage. So now that we understand this idea, let's keep it in mind. The threat against f7 and the bishop on g4, whether undefended or even defended, is a tactical pattern that appears in countless opening traps with either color. Recognizing it already puts us halfway ahead, both to set these traps ourselves and to avoid falling into them. And this is just the beginning, because next, we move on to the following tactical pattern in the opening, the royal divorce. The most common example I know of this royal divorce happens in the Sicilian defense classical variation, when white goes for the Sozin attack. The key idea here is to play e6 to directly oppose the bishop on c4, because if black replies instead with something like a6 or g6, the first player can go ahead and exchange the knight. Once it is recaptured, the pawn pushes to e5, and that's where the problems begin. Black cannot capture, because that leads exactly to what we are looking for. The queens end up facing each other, and the only piece defending the queen is the king, while the f7 square is under attack. White will follow up with bishop takes f7, forcing the king to separate from the queen. Once that happens, the queen is captured, and white wins immediately. So the pattern here is clear. The two queens are facing each other, and f7 is under attack. With that in mind, let's look at another example. This time, let's move to the England gambit, which arises in the queen's pawn opening after the move e5. White captures the pawn, and black continues with a less common line, developing the bishop to c5. Now it's normal to bring out the knight to f3, followed by d6. There are other options at this point, but it is also perfectly feasible to capture the pawn. After that, suddenly, it looks like black has lost their mind, developing the knight to e7. And now, in this position, the one thing you shouldn't do is capture the knight. Because if the knight is captured, the queens are now facing each other, and the f2 square is under attack. Exactly the same pattern we saw earlier, just in a different opening and with the colors reversed. Black wins immediately with bishop takes f2. The king has no choice but to capture, and by doing so, it steps away from the queen, allowing it to be captured immediately. This same tactical pattern appears in many other openings as well. This royal divorce also has a variation, one where it is not the bishop that causes the separation, but the knight. Let's take a look at it in an example from the Caro-Kann defense. The game begins with e4, c6, knight f3, and d5. The usual continuation here is to capture on d5, entering the exchange variation. But white often tries a sneaky trap instead, playing d3. Black exchanges pawns, but instead of recapturing, the knight jumps to g5. There are other good moves in the position, although the pawn can certainly be captured as well. After this, bishop takes d3 follows, and here we see the second version of the royal divorce trap. The queens are not directly facing each other, but they are indirectly connected through the bishop, and there is a dangerous discovered attack looming. The correct response for black is to move the queen, for example to c7, or even better, to block the file with knight d7. But not a natural move like knight f6, because that allows white to execute the idea. This time, it is the knight that separates the king from the queen by jumping to f7. It must be captured, and now the bishop takes advantage of the separation to deliver the discovered attack with bishop to g6, which also cuts off the king's path back to defend the queen. Once the bishop is taken, the queen is lost, and white wins immediately. So let's remember this second version of the pattern. The queens are indirectly separated by the bishop, and the knight threatens to jump into f7 to break the connection. Let's now see this same idea appear in another opening, this time in the Budapest gambit. White opens with d4, followed by knight f6, then c4, and the Budapest gambit is this pawn sacrifice with e5. The pawn is captured, and a secondary line involves bringing the knight to e4. This may come with the threat of an annoying check on b4, which is why the main idea for white is to prevent it with a3. After that, the game continues with d6. And while there are other options, the pawn can also be captured. Black recaptures with the bishop. And now we have the same setup we saw before. The queens are indirectly facing each other, and the knight is lurking nearby, threatening f2. Exactly the same tactical pattern, just in a different opening and with the colors reversed. The correct response here is to move the queen to c2, or even better, to block with knight d2. Because after any natural-looking move, like knight f3, black executes the same idea we saw earlier. It's the knight that separates the king from the queen by capturing on f2. Once it is captured, the discovered attack follows with bishop g3, which also prevents the king from returning to defend. White loses instantly. Now that we've seen these ideas in action, we have a much better grasp of the tactical theme of deflection in the opening, both to use it as attackers and to avoid falling into it ourselves. I hope this concept is now a bit clearer, because it forms the foundation for many opening traps. Now, let's move on to the next topic, which is just as important. As long as the king remains in the center of the board, this diagonal is extremely vulnerable, so much so that, rather than calling them traps, we could almost call them anecdotes. For example, the game begins with 1e4, and black replies with g5. Then comes d4, attacking the pawn, and it's defended with f6, which completely weakens the diagonal. What follows is instant punishment, fool's mate with queen h5, checkmate. And while we might think, who would ever play like that? This was actually a real game played at the Tromsø Olympiad in 2014. To this day, it remains the shortest known game ever played in an official competition. As for why the player with the black pieces chose this line, we may never know. But what we do know is this: weakening this diagonal leads to some of the fastest traps and checkmates in the game. For example, according to this book, the fastest known checkmate ever recorded in a game between masters is the 4-move game we are about to see. White opened with 1d4, then came knight f6, and now knight d2, a move that doesn't make much sense. Black responded with e5, the pawn was captured, and then the knight jumped to g4. The best move here would have been to develop the knight to f3, but instead, the first player pushed h3, double question mark for that move. In response, the knight jumped to e3. At that point, white had no choice but to resign. The queen was trapped, and the only way out would have been to capture the knight, but doing so would completely weaken the diagonal, leading to checkmate with queen h4. This tactical idea, deflecting the f-pawn to further weaken the diagonal, is very common. Sometimes it's done with a pawn pushing to e3, or, as in this case, with a knight. It's a tactical theme that appears in countless positions, and even Kasparov himself fell victim to it in the famous game he lost against the Deep Blue Computer during their 1997 match. Let's take a look. We're going into the Caro-Kann defense. White responds with the main line, playing knight c3. The pawn is captured and the knight recaptures. At this point, I like to recommend knight f6, the Tartakower variation, which offers excellent positions for the black pieces. But this time, Kasparov chose to play a variation used by his friend Karpov, developing the knight to d7. After that, white played knight g5. The idea behind this move is that the knight cannot be chased away so easily. For example, if black tries to push it back with h6, the knight can jump to e6 without consequences, just like in the previous example. And it cannot be captured, because that would weaken the diagonal, and queen h5 would deliver checkmate. So instead of h6, black plays knight f6, defending this critical square. Then comes bishop d3, and once again, there's no way to chase the knight away, because if h6 is played again, the knight simply jumps back to e6, and capturing it would allow bishop g6, checkmate. So the best course is to simply ignore the threat and play something like e6. White then develops the knight to f3, and the best plan for black is to bring out the bishop to e7 or d6, followed by castling. But Kasparov, mysteriously, decided to continue with h6, a mistake. Because once again, knight takes e6 follows. After it's captured comes bishop g6, and the king is left trapped in the center, while the white king castles comfortably. Under the precise and relentless attack of the computer-controlled pieces, with no chance to secure the king, the game was lost. Kasparov was forced to resign just a few moves later. As long as the king remains in the center of the board, weakening the diagonal on the king side is always extremely risky, and if we ever choose to do so, we must stay fully alert to the tactical consequences. An undefended piece is one of the most common tactical triggers for double attacks. For example, let's say we are playing the Ruy Lopez, and black replies with the Berlin defense, beginning with knight f6. White defends the attacked e4 pawn with d3, and suddenly the knight moves back to e7. It looks like black simply forgot something, leaving the e5 pawn hanging. And without thinking twice, we decide to capture it, a free pawn. But not so fast. The knight is undefended, the bishop is undefended, and the king is exposed to a check. What can we expect? White is actually on the verge of losing. Black continues with c6, gaining a tempo by attacking the bishop. The bishop retreats to c4, and then the queen moves to a5, delivering check. It does not matter what white plays, because on the very next move, the undefended knight on e5 will be lost. Just like everything we've seen so far, this is a tactical pattern, one that shows up in many different openings. These kinds of traps can be set up with the white pieces or with the black ones. For example, let's take a look at the following line. Mr. Kasparov was playing a simultaneous exhibition. He opened with one e4, and black replied with a Sicilian defense. Then came knight f3, d6, and here he chose to play the Alapin variation with c3. The knight was developed to f6, attacking e4, and Kasparov brought out his bishop to e2. Well, he may be the world champion, but he just left a free pawn hanging. No thinking, no second guessing, let's take it. Just like what actually happened during the simultaneous exhibition. But here's the problem. The knight is undefended, the king is exposed to a check, and black loses immediately to the classic queen a4 check, followed by capturing the knight. This video is not meant to provide an in-depth analysis of the entire variation. The point is to start training our minds to recognize a key warning sign. When a piece is undefended and the king is exposed to a potential check, we should immediately be on alert. And this will help us not only understand how to set up these traps, but also to avoid making critical mistakes in general. For example, let's now take a look at the Queen's Gambit. 1d4, d5, 2c4, and black captures. Then comes e4, and the second player follows up with e5. It's not a good idea to recapture here. The best move is to develop the knight to f3, though pushing d5 is also a viable option. Black brings out the knight to f6, attacking the e4 pawn, which is then defended by knight c3. And this knight is the only defender of the pawn. What better idea than to pin it with bishop b4? It seems natural. But according to the Lichess database, this mistake appears in over 300,000 games. When that happens, the bishop is undefended and the king is vulnerable to a potential check. What follows is no surprise. Black loses immediately after queen a4. Even knight c6, which would normally defend everything, is not possible because the d5 pawn controls that square. So once black covers the check, they end up losing the undefended piece anyway. Now, let's move on to the next important theme. Of all the tactical patterns we've covered so far, This one appears less often, but when it does, it tends to lead to beautiful and memorable checkmates. Let's begin with this position from the Italian opening. 1e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop c4. Instead of following any of the main lines, Black takes a risk with the move knight d4. The best response is simply to capture the knight, followed by castling and d3, continuing with normal development. In that case, Black would be left with doubled pawns. But what White shouldn't do is accept the undefended pawn on e5, because then comes queen g5, creating a double attack on both the knight and the g2 pawn. White might think they can escape by playing knight takes f7, attacking both the queen and the rook, but this only leads to an even faster defeat. The capture on g2 attacks the rook. It moves to f1, followed by queen takes e4. There is no choice but to block the check with the bishop, but since this piece is now pinned by the queen, the knight jumps to f3, checkmate. We've actually seen this pattern before in our checkmate motifs section, but that time it appeared in the middle game. Here, we're seeing it right out of the opening. This same mate pattern can also be found in the Fritz variation of the Italian opening. Let's go back now to move number 3. Instead of playing knight d4, as we just saw, Black responds with knight f6. Then comes knight g5, immediately targeting the f7 square. The only effective way to defend it is by pushing the pawn to d5, blocking the diagonal. The pawn is captured, and instead of going for the usual knight a5, the choice is knight d4. This is known as the Fritz variation. The best move here is to play c3. But the mistake would be to play d6, thinking it opens the diagonal again to threaten f7. Because the queen can capture, and after the same knight takes f7 with a double attack, there is a strong reply, queen c6, attacking both the bishop and the g2 square. If, for example, the knight takes the rook, the position for White is already lost. As we've seen before, there's no need to even capture the bishop, just entering on g2 is enough. The rook moves to f1 to defend, and the pattern is all too familiar. Check on e4, and the only response is to block with the bishop. But once again, the bishop is pinned by the queen, and the knight moves to f3, checkmate. Now let's look at the same tactical idea, but this time involving a mysterious queen move, either queen e2 or queen e7, depending on the color being played. Let's move on to the Budapest Gambit. The Budapest Gambit begins with d4, knight f6, c4, e5, offering a pawn sacrifice. The pawn is captured and the knight jumps to g4. The idea behind this gambit is that Black is waiting for White to try and defend the pawn with bishop f4. Then comes knight c6, attacking it again, and knight f3 to reinforce the defense. Next comes bishop b4, check, followed by knight d2, and now queen e7, which appears to simply increase the pressure on e5, but the real idea runs much deeper, as we're about to see. If White tries to push the bishop away with a3, Black simply ignores the threat and captures on e5. And the bishop cannot be taken, because that would allow knight d3, checkmate, since the pawn on e2 is pinned by the queen on e7. The correct move is not to capture the bishop, but instead to take on e5. Then comes knight takes e5, and once again, capturing on b4 is not possible due to the same knight d3 mate. However, playing e3 is a good solution. It defends the key square. This forces Black to either give up the bishop pair with bishop takes d2 or retreat the bishop to c5. In either case, the danger is gone and White is left with a slight advantage. So let's remember this tactical pattern, the queen lining up in an X-ray toward the king, because it shows up in a great number of opening traps. Let's close this chapter with one last position, this time from the Caro-Kann defense, as we dive into the two knights attack. This line arises after e4 c6, knight c3, d5, and then knight f3. The pawn is captured and the knight recaptures. One of Black's typical replies here is to try transposing into the Tartakower variation by developing the knight to f6. Now comes the mysterious move, queen e2. And if that happens, watch out, because once again we see the familiar X-ray pattern, with the queen aligned against the king. The correct move is to capture and eliminate the knight on e4 immediately. The mistake is to develop the knight to d7, because that allows the very pattern we've been studying, knight d6, checkmate. Just remember, the goal is not to memorize them blindly, but to truly understand the tactical ideas behind each one. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and help me create more content. See you in the next video.